Welcome to Strategic Momentum, the pod course with actionable tips, inspiring stories, and practical advice from progressive leaders on what it takes to break through business and career inertia and understand the business of work. I'm your host, Connie Steele. It's a new year, the early stages of a new decade, and a lot of things that used to be the norm just aren't the norm anymore, especially when it comes to career growth and development. In the last 20 years, we've seen a shift from linear to nonlinear career paths. The reality is most people don't stay with one company, one role, or even one field anymore. Many find themselves pivoting frequently, creating a career mashup. And as a learning management platform that supports work and career success, it's been our mission at Strategic Momentum to study this revolution and spread the knowledge. We, in fact, wanted to learn, what does career success mean to you? What does it take to reach your potential, and what's getting you stuck? So we implemented a study to assess just that. We teamed up with Scott Vanderbilt, a seasoned market research executive with over 20 years of experience across a breadth of industries and audiences to help us. As a research strategist who's consulted for more than 100 companies, Scott's studied almost every type of audience there is and has always been fascinated by what moves people to think and do the way that they do. Together, we've collectively gone through our own various twists and turns with our careers and have observed the shifts of others and in the broader marketplace. Our collective passions for learning about what's driven the change that we see today, as well as how they've impacted individuals and the companies they work for, was the inspiration to develop this initial survey and get a baseline read. We saw a gap and frankly just wanted to fill that void. So today's episode is focused on sharing some of those initial findings from the survey that we fielded at the end of May and at the beginning of June of 2020. Let's start off by sharing who we tapped into in the first place. We wanted to get the perspective of millennials and Gen Xers, who are the two largest groups in the workforce. We also included a sample of Gen Zers as well as boomers to reflect the reality of four generations operating together in the workplace today, because
there's a lot of differences in how they approach work, and it really goes down to life stage. It's when you're coming out of school, be it high school or college, you have a different mindset in how you are seeing your job and your career go from there. Where do you want to go? You're still exploring. When you get further in age, maybe you're doing less exploring and trying to maintain. So the really good idea there was to highlight those differences to see how their life story or their life history or their career path changes per generation. It's been fascinating.
So we ended up with over 430 people balanced across multiple demographic factors such as age, ethnicity, gender, and education. So let's dive into what we learned, starting off with how do professionals define a career in the first place. Thanks so much for joining us today, Scott.
Thank you for inviting me. This will be fantastic to talk about.
So the first thing we wanted to ask was, how do you define a career? And in fact, we started off with the question, and it was an open-ended question specifically. So we asked in a few words, describe the word career. And interestingly, there wasn't a singular definition, and it was what our gut was, but it was fascinating to see what the responses were. In fact, there was just a complete range. You had people saying, do what you love versus do it for a paycheck, focus on impact versus paying the bills, earning income versus satisfaction and achievement, a feeling or an attitude versus a specific thing that you do. Even people saying they noted their job function and title versus this aspiration an individual may have or a direction. And a lot of people talked about this path and journey versus really a current state. But what was really fascinating is that you had this mix of work versus work life.
Yep, absolutely. And we saw that. And it's almost like gearing up, ramping up your career, ramping up your job and discovering it. And we see it as like one aspect, building up through the 20s, building up through the 30s. It's like getting to that state of happiness within their job or their career. And then you kind of see it, okay, I'm maintained. I'm very nice and solid in my career. And then it just kind of, towards the end, it's like, okay, I'm just maintaining. I'm getting it what I need to get before I eventually go to retire. So it's definitely a path and a journey, but each group has, one, of course, are on different path given the age group they're in, but two, they just depending on where they're coming from too and how they've defined their career has changed over that career path.
And I think what's important to note is that when Scott and I looked at the data, it wasn't just looking at the information based on generations first. And as Scott mentioned before, we realized that there was something really correlated with the career stage, and that naturally, depending on which decade you were in, whether 20s, 30s, 40s, or 50s, it tended to align with certain career stages that people had. So there's an establishment phase, which typically is in your 20s. And that establishment phase is really characterized by you're starting out, you're trying to navigate things, you're exploring, building your skills, which then shifts to then this advancement stage. Advancement commonly aligns to those, in their late 20s and 30s. And this is where they're focusing on high achievement and further development. But then when you shift in your 40s, you're obviously still advancing, but for some, you might be starting to shift to this maintenance stage, which is trying to just hold on or keep up with your career. We were definitely looking at all the data in those career stages and the career phases and how the decades align to them. And just to really understand the differences, because we saw that just by looking at generations alone, didn't tell the whole story. We also wanted to understand how people would categorize a career based on specific definitions. In fact, we asked the question, which of the following best matches your definition of a career? These are the range of options we provided. Having a job that is satisfying to me, having the ability to do what I want to do, performing work that satisfies me, using my skills to perform work, performing work to build skills or experience, positively contributing to my field, performing work for the money, a job that I have to do to support myself or my family. And what we found, regardless of the age group, was that job satisfaction and using your skills to do the work commonly rose to the top as best matches for career definitions, not performing work for the money. But there were also differences across the age groups, which reflected fundamental needs of these individuals based on their life stage, generational group, and career stage they were in.
When we give them those definitions, we still see a wide range of choices here. We really do see a spread. And for example, the top one that everyone chose, having a job that is satisfying to me, a little over half selected that overall. We saw a lot of that in the 20s and 50s. So satisfying to me, when you're starting out, I want to be satisfied. When you're ending, I want to be satisfied because one, I want to do what I love when you're in the early on. In the 50s, I want to keep doing what I love because then I'm still interested and I can keep going until I retire from the field or leave the field. So it's me, let's get my skills, using everything I have for my work. And then it's just kind of like, okay, let's maintain and go on from there. But when you go down to performing work for money, it's not always about that. And actually the 40s had the lowest amount there.
Really, the order of which ones were first, second, third, fourth did vary. And it did align to where they were in their career stage. And in particular, when somebody was in their 30s, what was interesting, but obviously natural, is that the job that you have to support yourself or your family starts to be higher than all the other groups. And for those in their 40s, what was also interesting is that they defined this higher than other groups was performing work to build skills or experience, because they're probably at that point where they're trying to advance to that highest level in their career. But also they want to have control as defined by having the ability to do what I want. Whether in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, they're all different. You have a lot of diverse thinking that's in the workplace today. So to try to conform everyone to a unified definition of rewards, incentives, benefits for workers is going to be tough. So the punchline really when it comes to career definition is that it's broad, it's wide, and it's much more expansive than I think things used to be, say, 10 years ago. And even when we give a very specific definition, while there are some commonalities that come to the top, because foundationally, there are a few things that everybody needs, there is variability depending on where you are, depending on what age you're at, and depending on what stage you're at. So it's important to just consider. Another area we wanted to understand was the career goals of today's professionals. We've read, observed, and experienced how millennials have focused on finding purpose in their work or have pursued professions that would enable them to deliver true impact in the world as compared to other generations where it was more inwardly focused. We also believe that today's workforce wants so much more, and as such, we were searching to better understand that. So we asked the importance of 16 career goals that were broad in nature and included statements such as work flexibility, entrepreneurship, compensation, being an agent of change, and even becoming wealthy. This is what we found across the age groups. Really across all the different decades, there were two that pretty consistently came to the top, which were foundational, which was earning a steady income and getting compensated fairly. But certainly that's not surprising in light of the pandemic where there was so much uncertainty and folks need that. But what we found certainly interesting is bringing one's passions to the forefront also were one of the top goals. It just highlights this shift and desire to connect with what one does day in, day out, which we believe really wasn't necessarily the case 10 to 20 years ago.
And what's interesting is, again, they could answer any of the questions that they wanted to answer, but when we're looking at by groups too, you could really see where those goals are, where those passions lie. Like the 40s, I think we get so much more diversity in what their goals are.
Right. And so if we started with those in their 20s, what was interesting to us is that the goals that really came to the top had a lot to do with ones that involved a higher order meaning and impact. Because they noted aligning my passion with purpose, making a difference in my field, helping others who are in need. So we also realized that when you come out of school, the world's your oyster, and there's many times this optimism, but we see that aligning to just the mentality of millennials and Gen Zers wanting to truly make a difference early on. What also was interesting is flexibility. I think everybody has noted that trend where now you can work from anywhere at any time. And that is something that also came through. Another interesting finding was that for those establishing and advancing their career, the 20s and 30-year-old age groups, we tended to see a range of goals that were equally important. Not only did those in their 30s identify with aligning my passion and purpose as an important goal, but pursuing an entrepreneurial venture was also a focus. And then for those in their 30s, what was fascinating to see is that building a successful business, that entrepreneurial bent really started to come to the top at that point.
Absolutely. After they've gotten their skills and they're getting somewhat more comfortable, it seems like, okay, now perhaps I can go do something like that. Or I can, believing that you can. And
what we know is that many millennials either have an idea to start a side hustle or they're already doing a side hustle. And it started very early on, that very first recession, or it started early on during that recession of 2007, 2008, where they had to. So now it seems to be something that's sort of ingrained potentially in the way they think and their behavior. So, that just was interesting that it really proved our thought that being able to do different things, building different things is now showing up in the data. What would you say about those in their 40s?
as I mentioned, it's kind of everywhere. It's been interesting. Of course, earning steady income, that part of your life, you're hoping, the income's going well, so you can do exactly working in a field that you're passionate about and getting compensated for it fairly for what you're doing. You're hoping you're established enough that you can start, attacking some of these other goals that you perhaps have. But it is all about like settling in and kind of expanding out at that point.
One particular goal, which they noted as most important, was bringing one's passions to their career. Mm-hmm. That definitely came to them. And you and I can completely relate because we're at that phase where, when you've worked for some time, you now want to focus on what it is that drives you, that makes you happy, versus really being focused on something that's financially and monetarily oriented.
Exactly. Sometimes it's those thoughts. I've done that. I want to do something really cool. It could be related to what you're doing now, or it's just like I want to expand out and do something that really lights the fire. It is the passion, lights the fire, and just really hits on all those aspects of what you're looking for in a job, what you're looking for in a career, but just what you're looking for just makes you really, really happy and want to read thousands of pages of things about. It's really gotten to that point that you're like, okay, I'm ready to branch out, really to bust out and really, really do something I'm really, really excited about.
I think what we hypothesize too is just this shift in mentality to want to align work life with just personal life. The personal and professional now are completely blended, particularly due to the pandemic. And everyone does realize that when you do what you love, the money will come. But when you feel handcuffed a bit and are doing it out of obligation versus bring your true passion and self to work, you really can't kind of unleash that full potential.
Exactly. You're not giving your mind a chance, really, when you're in that prior state to go ahead and get excited about it, because it's like, maybe there is nothing exciting about it that you found yet. And when you're starting to get excited about it, it's like, oh, you're doing it. You're creating more work. You're finding more opportunities. You're finding more of those aspects of that particular line of work that are very, very fascinating. And you're really expanding yourself. And you're finding the work. You're finding all those insights. You're finding all that information and doing it. And I think that's where, the money will come, because that's what that particular job, perhaps, or that particular field is really craving, but you're advancing it as well, which is, again, you're getting money because you're advancing it, and you're advancing it for fun. You're like, oh, that's great. It's a bonus.
Absolutely. And so for those in their 50s, it's interesting, but not surprising that really the two main goals that they have by far and away was earning a steady income and getting compensated fairly. 11% identified being an agent of change, being important. So for us, really the punchline is that they're focused on financial stability for themselves rather than having a positive impact based on the work they do right now. It's a more inward and self-oriented goal versus an outward and community-oriented mindset at this particular phase they're at.
Exactly. And they're not looking to be an agent of change. They're not looking to work with multiple businesses. They're really about maintaining and kind of, always hate to say it, riding it out now that they're at that stage. And it's about, okay, now I'm comfortable. I'm doing what I want to do perhaps, but I'm ready to kind of slow down and take perhaps more time for life itself over work.
And I think that unto itself, when you now understand what the career goals of somebody in their 50s are versus career goals of those who are in their 20s and 30s, and when they're all working together, that's where you can see conflict emerge in an organization, because fundamentally they're not aligned on maybe what they each individually want. So subsequently, their effort, their mentality is going to be in conflict with one another. As everyone knows, there are circumstances in your career journey that can accelerate your growth and development, but also ones that can hinder it. We were focused on learning about both in this study. And those factors we inherently knew weren't going to be one-dimensional in any way. In fact, we knew we had to look at all facets of what workers believed could advance their career. So we covered areas such as education, work environment, skills, and people, to name a few. What came through wasn't the hard skills, work experience, and formal education.
Yeah, it's still, these fascinate me all every single data point. But what we really found are things that we're always kind of told, these are good items to have in your career, not necessarily at the beginning, but it's whispered all the way through that, soft skills, coming up and when dealing with soft skills, learning the trick to soft skills, learning how to best advance soft skills. What we got is about almost 4 in 10 said soft skills were extremely important to them for career advancement. And what we see is, it's later in the 20s, as I was talking about, and it kind of builds up all the way through the 40s. So it's one of those aspects where, again, you're told it's important. You might not believe it at first, but as you're going along in your career, you start like, yeah, that's actually, I got my skills down. I got to start working with others, perhaps with networking opportunities or just talking, getting to know more people. And you really see that soft skills being extremely important as you move up through your 40s. But along those same line, it's the work mentality and being, we have open-minded, transparent as examples we've provided them. It's that, how are you approaching work? That's extremely important. Again, as you go up, building up over those, all those different age groups, is that work mentality. The group in their 20s are going to approach it different than the ones in their 30s and their 40s. It's about being open-minded in a lot of ways. It's about being transparent. It's about what helps you manage your career, what helps you conduct your career, but also how to operate with others. And I think those were like two of the top aspects of these extremely important career advancement factors, or the drivers of career advancement that this group saw.
One of the key things I think that we found that was interesting is that hard skills, work experience, and formal education didn't appear to carry the same amount of weight anymore. They weren't the ones that rose to the top. Did that surprise you, Scott?
It did, because again, some of those things you always hear in a career, formal education is critical for your career. Having that formal career is almost just necessary to get particular jobs or to get particular advancement in a job. And it's not necessarily being seen as a critical component for career advancement, more of just meeting the requirements perhaps of something, some role or some job that's being offered out there. But they're not seeing necessarily that as being critical for their advancement. Rather, they're looking at other aspects. Again, as I mentioned, soft skills or work mentality, how they're approaching work is what they're really seeing as those are the critical aspects of advancement.
And do you think some of that might be because of just the explosion of entrepreneurship and how many have found completely new paths to build their career that it's outside of the traditional corporate or trade or academic paths?
Those in their 40s right now were given like almost no options. Like it was assumed you're going, in order to get a good job, you're going to formal high education, i.e. college, or even further on grad school and professional schools. But what we're seeing here is only, roughly about 1 in 10, a little over 1 in 10 in their 20s think formal high education is important for career advancement, which is really, really fascinating. It rises a little bit in the 30s and it's generational. It's definitely, they have other ways. They have other things that they could do.
Overall, soft skills, work mentality, culture, work style, job fulfillment, and continuous learning rose to the top as the most important factors in advancing a career. In other words, the way you work, your mindset, and how you ultimately feel about your job is what's deemed most important to help you advance versus credentials, degrees, and skills. And for those in their 20s and 40s, clarity of personal purpose was considered an important characteristic in advancing their career. It's interesting that those just starting out have identified early on that finding what it is you're meant to do can help you rapidly accelerate. However, for those who've worked for some time and who are more likely established in their profession, are now just searching for something more to create that positive momentum. Scott sees it as an interesting juxtaposition.
It has really become a personal career versus the established career in terms of what people think your career should be. They're really defining it at a younger age group of this is what I want that career to be. And as we mentioned earlier, we're seeing it played out in all of these questions.
For those in their 30s, it turns out that on-the-job training was considered the most important factor to helping them advance. Getting that exposure and understanding around what needs to be done in order to be successful is so foundational. Yet another important factor was work environment and culture. This was something that I didn't fully get when I first started working. I didn't have any of that context. And there's no question that after working for a certain number of years, you personally start to pick up on those various dynamics in an organization that can affect you. But it does seem that those in their 20s have figured out what works and what doesn't with respect to career growth and progression much earlier than those of other age groups.
It feels like almost that they're further along in some mentality aspects in identifying what's working. And it feels like perhaps those in their 30s and 40s had to go through that early aspects of a career, early aspects of jobs to identify like, oh yeah, that's important. But when they're going out to seek their own work or build their own career, as I mentioned, or just building their own jobs and what they want to do, they learn that they have to go out. They're forced to almost go out and learn those soft skills so that they can promote without the formal structure of a company, perhaps, or a formal structure of what career used to be. Whereas everybody else had to do that at one point. So they found critical success in doing that, and they're applying it and they're finding it's working. I was talking to a lot of people recently about the way the current coronavirus pandemic has changed the work style and the work just day to day for almost everybody out there in terms of those office jobs, would say, or those jobs where it's more formal, in that it actually helps show that perhaps working from home for a lot of people does work. You know, they're doing the work where there were fears that employees wouldn't do the work if they work from home, but it actually really opened up a lot of people's eyes that it works. And as you mentioned, the millennials going through all these environmental changes with the recession in the 2007, 2008 really allowed people, even if out of necessity or not, it gave them an opportunity to explore other avenues and get off that traditional track. So I think we're going to keep seeing all these environmental changes affecting the way people see how their career should be built, how they should continue with a career, how they should build a career just on their own. And I think, like I said, the coronavirus is doing it for working from home, working from any time we want, which is also helping the freelance environment and things like that. We're really seeing those changes, and they're being forced upon us, but they're also at the same time not in a negative way. It's almost a positive way because that is possible. And I think the younger generations are adapting extremely well because they've been forced to, and now it's open to them.
Definitely. So what else would you say about those in their 50s and what they feel is important?
The ones in their 50s is interesting because, as I said, they're cemented in their career. They're getting, they see the end. Maybe it's not soon, but they're starting to think about it, and they're seeing kind of a reflection of where they are in their work. And perhaps a lot of them in the 50s, from what we're seeing so far, is that they've done their work, they've done their career, and now they're on that maintenance schedule where they're going to keep going as they are. They're not necessarily going to break out or do anything that's going to go outside what they've created for themselves. Well, doesn't mean that they're not going to, but they're less inclined to, perhaps, because they've done it. And they're on the way to okay, I don't want to get wild and crazy before the end because I want to keep and maintain what I have. And so what we're seeing is that the work environment, work style, work mentality, it's all about the overall work environment, I'll say here, is what they're truly saying that is, that's what helps them in their career. It's about stability almost in a way.
Let's flip it now from understanding those factors that they identified as most important to helping them advance. Let's look at the ones that they said were most likely to hold them back. And what did we find, Scott, on what these different age groups said, what inhibited their career at the end of the day?
It is all about that work life, work environment. And it potentially is because of all these other career minded individuals, and the lower age groups have very different way of approaching those careers. Looking at the poor management structure, which is interesting because that seems like always one that's a younger age group thing to have a problem with that. They want to freely. They know it. They don't want to change, perhaps. Or again, they don't want to be adaptive to what's coming because it conflicts with what they want in a career and on their career path.
So do you think when that is identified, this poor management structure, which you actually see across all decades, it really just comes down to maybe for those who are in their 20s and 30s, wanting to have something that's more flat and fluid really tends to fit their individual style or desires more so. But those, as you mature more, maybe you have been used to something that's a little more rigid. They're used to that. But when that shifts to something that's a little more adaptive, that can be a challenge. So, across the board, everybody identified that as being something that can inhibit them. But it may be the dynamics that they're dealing with that are causing the most pain. It'll just differ depending on, which group you're in.
Yeah, exactly. They really want something flatter, that they have more contact with that overall client or that overall individual that's requesting the work.
Right. I think in looking across those decades too, and seeing what do impact them, is that they all had said no access to on-the-job training, or at least most. They for 20s and 30s, it was about the training. And what was interesting for those in their 20s, just not having the connection. So it was just acknowledgement and understanding that they're not formulating those relationships that they realize are necessary to move forward. But I also thought it was interesting that they want variety. So staying in one career, they know is what's going to hold them back. And they want more, that it's never a singular path. Likely, it's probably parallel pathing.
Absolutely.
Career inhibitors conveyed by those in their 20s were also echoed in the 30s age group. In addition, they identified a lack of sponsors as key barriers to career growth and development. They know that having that village of support to champion their efforts along the way is valuable. So the last major area we explored involved people's attitudes and perceptions around work and their career. We covered a broad range of categories that included training, education, work experiences, and perceived core needs for their job, and wanted to understand to what extent they agreed or disagreed with these various statements. So what we found is that what really dominated was the importance of relationships and working with others, that people piece, and contributions in the workplace, having that positive impact internally and externally rose to the top. It wasn't hard skills that were the most important. It wasn't the money that was most important. It was people and impact, ongoing skill development, and in fact, diversity of experiences and openness to new approaches, which was all really interesting to us because it proved to us this fundamental shift that was happening, particularly due to the thinking of the millennial generation. And we know also that thinking is somewhat aligned with the Gen Zers too.
Absolutely. So what we're seeing a lot in these age groups, relationships are important. And it seems like, across the board, I would say positive impact on clients and customers, it's important to have that. We see it, of course, across the board, and we see it building up to the 40s, the age group of the 40s, and slightly down to the 50s. But everyone believes, this is important. Even starting off in the 20s, it's important to have that. Relationships are important across work and career. The 20s see that as an important aspect, and we're seeing it for the 30s. It rises up. For the 40s, it goes up, and then again slightly down to the 50s. So they see it. That's important, and as we discussed in other parts, with these communications building up their careers, their jobs, their side hustles, all these different jobs, and what the 20s are building up, they really realize relationships are important. Relationships are important, I would say, not only clients and customers, but just building those soft skills, building relationships amongst similarly minded people that are in the field that can help them as well, I think is definitely important. But they see how that really, really impacts how well they do.
And do you think some of that is just due to the proliferation of social media?
That's a good point. I think it helps tremendously because I think they can see different viewpoints, different attitudes, but it also helps get their message out. So I think they can kind of see it as a relationship builder, as a research tool, figure out what people are doing or saying out there, but also helping get that message out. And I think they're making best use of these newer tools than perhaps any other generation.
To recap, what would you say are the key takeaways that somebody wanting to look at the study would learn?
What my key takeaways would be is everybody's career is different. We're all operating at given different experiences and given different perceptions and attitudes. But at the same time, we're also seeing that perhaps they're running faster. You know, the 20s will have this thing sorted out, but they're adapting to the newer environments. So the coronavirus pandemic forcing us to work from home, they're like, yep, we could do it. See, we're proving we can do it. They are really adaptive. And I think they've taken every challenge and they are changing what it means to have a career, as it probably will change again. But they're showing that this is a different aspect or idea altogether in that they're adaptive. But look, we've opened up the whole career environment. You know, it is about the relationships. We've discovered it early and we're going to be more successful by finding out these things much earlier than the other groups did.
I think that's great insight. And I would say to add on to that, there's been this shift probably for a majority of people, or I believe it's really for a majority of people, that because they're defining what they want out of their career much more expansively, and it's not singular, and it's not also likely a sequential career path anymore, that it really involves being able to bring your whole self to work. Everybody wants to bring all of themselves. And that to me was reflected in the responses around wanting to work in a field they're passionate about, aligning their passions with purpose. You know, while it doesn't show up as highly for those in their 50s, certainly is the case for everybody 40s and under. And this need to be connected to what it is you do when you work that many hours in a day is necessary. So it's not about conforming anymore to what an entity may want. It's trying to find your own individual fulfillment and what it is that you may do. Is really what I walked away with, and seeing that this, the thesis that I've had on work and career and what it means has really started to come to fruition in the data. And also that point of them realizing it's the soft skills, it's the mentality, it's continuously learning, which we see again and again. We knew it to be true, given what we've done, both of us having worked in technology for some time, that this ability to continuously learn, adapt, grow, pivot is the norm. And it seems to be the default too of those who are in their 20s and 30s, as evidenced by the data. Now, what would you say the implications are to the individual? But what do you believe are the implications to the companies that they subsequently work for?
Companies have to, and it's probably an old thing that they hear all the time, is they have to learn to adapt. And it's not a one size fits all. But I think when you open it up and you don't make a one size fits all for the company, and you listen to the employees by talking to them what they want to do, what they're hoping to do, what will advance their careers, what will help them do what they want to do. When you listen to them and learn more about where they are and what they like to do, I think everything fits. And I say that in that perhaps some older generations have a particular way that they want to do things and how they want their careers to go versus somebody in their 40s, 30s, 20s. And so I think overall the implications are learning where each group is in terms of their career path and their likes, dislikes, et cetera, and matching it across the board in terms of organizational structure, in terms of how they approach each of the employees with providing, as simple as providing information about where the company is right now, learning those different structures that they all work best within. It could be a more structured environment that the older generations perhaps prefer versus more of an environment where the younger generations prefer the flat organizational structure. There are ways to build it, but I think overall what companies have to do is learn how those pieces fit together, because it's not a one size fits all any company by any stretch of the imagination, even today. But the way you can fit one group that wants to do this versus another group that wants to do this, I think it's an interlocking piece, and I believe it can't work.
So what I hear is that there's this need to be a bit more fluid and open to the way that you need to work, because there's a more fluid mindset and approach with the individual. Yet it all comes down to alignment. So you can align their passions, their interests, their goals, so you can unlock their potential.
And giving each group the power to make their career what they want to make it. And
so subsequently building the business of you.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks so much, Scott, for joining me today and going through all this wonderful insights that we've gathered and we've set our minds on for some time, because as we're both super passionate about understanding how careers have changed, because we've been through this whole journey ourselves.
Exactly. And thank you for having me. I truly love this stuff. It is really cool. And I keep finding more and more insights, which just means it's just a gold mine of things that we can learn to help careers and just help businesses all in all just be better.
As we've learned, depending on where you are in your career stage, what you want, what you need, what you believe is going to be fundamentally different. And among the now largest generation in the labor force, the millennials, this desire to have a greater impact, align passion with purpose, highlights a shift towards needing something more to be fulfilled and achieve their growth potential. And what we are also seeing is that these needs are echoed by many Gen Xers now as well. Observing and experiencing for myself these shifting work, career, and personal dynamics is what motivated me to want to understand the root cause behind these changes. Because I realized that by diving deep into what was going on and why, I could explain my own career journey. One that hasn't been linear, sequential, and narrow. Rather, it's been expansive, exploratory, multifaceted, and fluid. And I know that many of you have had a career path that has had its twists and turns, and you've probably had to Frankenstein your advice. In today's world, things are changing even faster, and I see that guidance and support doesn't exist at the same level as when I started my career. As a result, it feels like there's a void, so I wanted to help connect those dots for others and even myself. And all that was the catalyst for me to write my upcoming book, Building the Business of You, a system to align passion and growth potential through your own career mashup. Because what motivates me is helping people and the companies they work for break through and get unstuck. My goal is to provide clarity when it may feel like chaos, outline a way forward when it seems that there isn't a path to take. I'll be sharing more details about the book in my next podcast episode. And to keep up to date on the official release, February 11th, check out bizofyou.co. That's bizofyou.co. Thanks for listening to Strategic Momentum. To connect with Scott, you can follow him on LinkedIn at Scott Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt. If you've liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show and share this podcast with friends and colleagues. And of course, we always appreciate ratings and reviews. You can also get show notes, links, and more tips and advice from this episode at strategicmomentum.co. We'll have some of those top-line findings from the study on the site, and we'll continue to share more insights over the next several months. So make sure to check in for the latest updates. I'm Connie Steele, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.